Hello, been a while. Welcome back to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate given their proper attention in a world we're both in the decline. Yes, we've done all that. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for the week and a half of no episodes. I had a sudden increase in workload and just didn't have time, but things have settled down again now, so it should be back to twice a week. It will for the moment, but if it does get full of work again, I'll have to go back down probably to one a week, but I will keep going every week. I won't just vanish for like two people who missed me. But anyway, with that being said, this episode will cover the different opinions as to how the government should approach the second wave of coronavirus currently affecting the UK. Over the last few weeks, the UK's coronavirus count has started to rise dramatically and is currently increasing faster than in the first wave back in April and March of this year. This has led to people calling for more action to be taken, although the method people want is very mixed. So for the sake of time and simplicity, the episode will split into arguments for essentially a nationwide circuit breaker lockdown or something similar, and those for alternative approaches. Quick reminder that the aim is not to try and prove which side is correct, but rather simply to highlight the different opinions and provide a comparison. I will start with the arguments in favour of a nationwide lockdown, followed by the arguments opposed with a comparison at the end. Moving on to the nationwide lockdowns, essentially the main idea is that the UK's current daily rise is on average over 15,000 for the last 2 weeks, and is in fact much higher than during the first wave and the first peak, and as such some have claimed that there is an even stronger case to be made for a nationwide lockdown. Some have gone so far as to call for another long and complete nationwide lockdown, similar to the one we saw in spring and summer, and essentially make the claim that if we don't, then we will be continually going into small lockdowns for many months, so it's better to get it over with and actually keep it going for longer, because some have claimed that, rightly or wrongly so, that the government came out too early for whatever reason. Others, however, don't go to as extreme a measure and have called for what is known as a circuit breaker lockdown, which is essentially a full 2 to 3 week shutdown of the country designed to prevent a mass escalation. So essentially there's a fear that you infect one person, they infect, say, 4 or 5 people, then that keeps going and it just exponentially grows. So the idea is to have a shorter lockdown, essentially just to keep the number of virus cases under control. And this would also help limit the economic costs, given that it would only be for 2 weeks. And this is what has been done in Wales, but hasn't been done in England or Scotland. And it also stops the virus spreading from infectious areas to less infectious areas, because everyone's in lockdown. You might have the infection without knowing and leave, and then spread it to people elsewhere, which isn't in lockdown, but given everyone's in lockdown, it's a bit harder to do so. Some have accused regional lockdowns of being too slow to implement, and essentially that this tier system has created a buffer, meaning that responses are often not effective enough. For example, the tier 3 lockdown in Manchester was delayed by a number of days due to disputes between the local and national governments over financial support, and therefore a nationwide lockdown would simply be easier to do. Continued examples of fines and arrests have also meant that people aren't following the rules, and that therefore we should just have to go into a lockdown. People can't be trusted to do it themselves, so the government should take the initiative and respond more forcefully. People also may be confused over the different tiers of lockdown. It seems that every week there's every day even rather, there's a high number of locations that are changing from one tier to another. None have gone down yet, but lots are going up, and they can go up quite quickly, and people may not be aware, but if the whole country's going into a lockdown, it would be a lot simpler. The NHS track and trace system has also been repeatedly criticised for being too slow and missing contacts. They were recently exposed for having, I think it was something like 28,000 new cases in a day which weren't recorded because they ran out of space on an Excel document. And it's also run by multiple different privatised firms, meaning that there is no communication between them, which I can say from personal experience. I've been contacted many times by many different people in the same day and in a very small space of time. So there's certainly a case to be made that the system could be a lot better, and the failure of that system means that a selective and localised approach isn't working properly. Alongside this, many have also called for an extension to the furlough scheme and for financial support to be continued to ensure that a national lockdown doesn't harm the economy any more than it already has done. And finally, similar to the video I made a few weeks ago, there's many people who essentially just state that health is the most important aspect of society at the moment, and that the economy, businesses, jobs will recover over time, but obviously if people are dead, they can't recover, and therefore a lockdown is more important than any other cost, and health should be our main priority. Moving on now to the arguments opposed to a national lockdown, essentially the biggest criticism, obviously, is the economic cost. And as such, local lockdowns are being favoured because they allow you to slow the spread of the virus, but they don't induce some of the massive economic problems that have come with a nationwide lockdown. And essentially, the main argument posed at the moment is, if you have a town or a city or a village with essentially no cases, or it's extremely well controlled, why put them into lockdown because a city 200 miles away is having problems? It doesn't make sense to a lot of people to reduce these high economic costs for what would be potentially little benefit by placing safe or relatively safe areas into lockdown. And therefore, by preventing travel from areas with high cases and putting them in a local lockdown means that you can slow the spread without a high economic cost. Furthermore, countering the idea of continuing the furlough scheme and financial support, the government is already at its highest level of debt ever, and therefore some would claim that they simply can't afford to keep funding this and keep going on forever, and that life can't just continue the way it's going. Some would make the case that 2 weeks or a circuit breaker lockdown may not be enough. Essentially, you might slow down the spread, and then the second everyone comes out, it just keeps going again. And then you may end up with just recurring 2-week lockdowns that don't stop, and there's essentially no benefit to them. And if they become continuous, if it's every other week you're going into a 2-week lockdown, or every 3 weeks, whatever that is, then the government's financial costs would still be exponentially higher than if they were with local lockdowns. Some would also point to the fact that in many areas, although cases are rising, the number of hospital admissions and deaths is a lot lower. And that's because one of the main contributing factors believed to be in the rise of this second wave was the fact that students are travelling all over the country going to university, and obviously students mix in parties, and therefore it's a lot easier to spread than if they're all at home. And therefore, something like 99% of students, or most of people of student age, aren't going to be negatively affected by coronavirus unless they have underlying health conditions. So they are the cause of this spread, essentially. It's contained to universities, a lot of people would say, and therefore you wouldn't need to implement a nationwide one, rather keep those who are at risk isolated and allow everyone else to go about their usual lives. In the idea of NHS track and trace, although it could be improved, some people would say that it's better than not having it, and it still does work. So while they may only hit 2/3 of people, that's better than 0, which they had before, and therefore if they did make efforts to improve the NHS track and trace system, that would be more beneficial in the long run than just keeping implementing lockdowns. Also, there's this idea of the emotional impact of a continued lockdown. Essentially, many people haven't seen their families and their friends or whatever the hell it is for a very long time. And as such, having another nationwide lockdown would be furtherly detrimental to their mental health, and therefore it shouldn't be implemented. The current system has also been essentially saying that it does work. Essentially this idea that we just need better enforcement. That we have a system that can work in theory, it's just that a lot of people tend to ignore it. So with better enforcement, obviously at the moment, police are having some of the NHS track and trace information provided to them. So if we just enforce it better, there wouldn't be a need for a full lockdown. And then finally, on the idea of this high number of cases, essentially there's this idea that testing has gone up immensely since when the virus first started. So while there may be more recorded cases, some would wager that the number of actual cases may indeed be lower because there were no hidden examples of coronavirus. Moving on now to the comparison. Regarding views on the economy, those supporting a nationwide lockdown would either say if it's a circuit breaker that it's only 2 weeks, it would be quick, it wouldn't be that detrimental, rather than the nationwide continuous lockdown would essentially say that the economy isn't as important as health. While those supporting a local lockdown would say, why harm the local economies of places that don't have high levels of coronavirus? It doesn't make sense to induce such a massive economic cost for what would be potentially very little benefit. Then on the idea of government spending, those supporting a bigger lockdown would say that they just need to keep spending, that they can pay off the debt over time, that this is a perfect example of a crisis where you essentially do what you have to now and worry about the consequences later. While those supporting a local lockdown or just opposed to a general nationwide lockdown would say that we can't keep affording to do this because in the future taxes will be higher, there'll be less spending on other things, and ultimately it's going to cause so many problems that people are neglecting the long-term consequences. Regarding track and trace, those supporting a nationwide lockdown would say that it's not working properly and it can't effectively help support local controlling of the virus, but those on the other side would say that they should focus on improving it. Why institute a massive and expensive lockdown when they can just improve the system? It's quite obvious what's wrong with NHS track and trace, so if they just fixed those problems, they wouldn't need to be an entire country put into lockdown. Regarding the idea of young people, those supporting a nationwide lockdown would say keep them where they are, keep everyone where they are, because they're just travelling around the country. They may spread it, even if you have a local lockdown. Once it's over, they may get it afterwards, the asymptomatic, and it's quite easy to spread. Or those on the other side would say keep the people in high-risk sectors, and people who are high-risk, isolated, keep essentially high number of cases, keep those areas contained, and that's stopping the spread nationwide. Regarding the idea of more testing, those in favour of a higher lockdown would probably argue that, yes, there is more testing, but the numbers are still incredibly high, and you can't just disregard the entire fact that there's more cases by saying, we're testing more people. There's still a number of cases, and those cases, whether or not they're seen, still exist. And those on the other side would say that it just looks worse. A local lockdown would be better because we know where the cases are. There aren't hidden examples all over the country that suddenly emerge if we test more people, because we've been testing quite a lot of people for quite a long time now. And as such, we just see where there are high number of cases because we've tested them and we put those areas into lockdown. And then finally, on the idea of local lockdowns being slow, those supporting a nationwide one would say they are slow. It's confusing, it can be problematic and be affected by bureaucracy and government failure, and therefore a nationwide one would be much more effective and much easier to just introduce and be done with. While those supporting a local lockdown would say, for example in Manchester, the reason it was slow was because Andy Burnham didn't accept the financial package the government was offering. That, yes, it may be slow, but that's due to individuals, not due to the system itself, and over time it will get better, and again, just avoiding the cost of a bigger lockdown. Ultimately, though, one's view on how the government should address this issue depends upon their focus. For example, if you live somewhere with extremely low numbers of cases, it makes more sense for you to have local lockdowns. But for those looking at a nationwide issue, they may want a shorter total one. For those who focus more on the economy, they will want local lockdowns. For those people who are primarily focusing on health and don't have much trust in the government, they would argue for a nationwide lockdown. So while the opinions are disputed, what is clear, however, is the government's stance on this, which is essentially that they have chosen to go down the local route. Last week they introduced a 3-tier system. Scotland's introduced a 5-tier system today. Essentially just more cases, the higher number of the high restrictions you put in, and that's the system they are going with. But ultimately though, what is your view on this issue? Is there anything I missed, got wrong, or could do better? And also, are there any topics you want to see me cover? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments. And be sure to check back on Monday for the different approaches to international aid. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all soon.